The West has embarked on a radical self-critique. And my sense is, it's gone too far. First of all, I am a clinical psychologist and a professor. The ideas that I'm really going after are those that animate the radical leftists. I'm very careful with my words. Well, that's also partly why I wasn't very happy with Bill C-16. It's about transgender rights. But it's also about the government's decision to compel the contents of voluntary speech. It's like, sorry, no. No politics in the realm of compelled speech, especially not if you're motivated by your goddamn ideology.
We have to be able to say what we have to say badly!
I don't think there's anything you can do to me to get me to abide by that law. Atheism is fundamentally a doctrine of negation. All it states is there is no God. You lose something like that, you lose the motivating ethos of your community.
Peterson.
Why do meaningful things? And the answer is, well, because life is suffering. Do some difficult things, do them well, and you justify your miserable existence. Accept the burdensome condition of suffering, and you transcend it. There's so much possibility in front of us now. Let's have a conversation to figure out how to set things right. We could do that, so that would be good.
They say that the human race is doomed, that we have lost touch with our true nature, that the media has corrupted us, and that the planet has no future. I disagree. I believe that humanity is full of hope, and that our salvation lies within each one of us. My name is Brian Rose, and my job is to listen, the oldest method of learning known to man. Each week I seek out individuals that are changing the world, people who are living and thinking in a different way. Their stories will challenge your beliefs, make you question your choices, and perhaps inspire you to change. I never planned on doing any of this, but now I can't stop. Join me on this mission and make humanity something we can all be proud of.
It's time for you to man up, to once and for all tell your mind who the fuck is boss. I need a fucking answer. What's it gonna be? I don't know what it is about this fucking sport, but it attracts people that really need to do deep work on themselves.
I failed in this city. All these bad memories. I never really felt like I gave a fuck about me or my life. I almost killed myself, like.
Think about something that is going to drive you when it really hurts. Some kind of demon you want to fight.
This is not Pussy Man, this is Iron Man. Under pressure reveals true character. What are you gonna do? You gonna be in Chattanooga May 20th or what?
The New York Times calls him the most influential public intellectual in the Western world right now, Jordan B. Peterson. And the night before I filmed this, I went to the O2 Arena here in London and watched 8,000 people listen to a conversation between him and Sam Harris about religion and life. Incredible. The last time I was at that arena, I saw Beyonce on stage. This man has gone from relative obscurity 2 years ago at the University of Toronto to now being a man who drives public opinion. And I don't agree with everything that Jordan says, but I think he has a lot of very powerful moments. And his book, 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos, walks you through about taking personal responsibility, about not judging yourself to others, but by who you were yesterday. And I just love a lot of his core values and his real reliance on storytelling and how it's really part of our DNA. I really enjoy my time with Jordan. I think he's just going to continue to get bigger and more influential in this world. And I like the fact that we have someone unique here having a debate, and it says a lot for long form content, something we've been doing here for 7 years at London Real. And as Jordan said, people are not as stupid as we thought they were, and they really want to engage with complex ideas over long periods of time. So sit back, relax, and enjoy my conversation with Jordan Peterson. And inside London Real, we are working with our Speak to Inspire course. I'm teaching people from all over the world how to become better public speakers. And whether that means to get a promotion in the boardroom or get on the TED stage like I did, this is a way to scale your message. And here's a little bit more about what we do.
London Real doesn't stop when the conversation ends. You see, that's when we get started. Because everything begins with a thought, and then comes the action. The London Real Academy is our global transformation platform. Here we bring together thousands of students from over 75 countries. Whether you want to build a profitable business from your passion, or learn to speak to inspire, or broadcast yourself with your very own podcast, or accelerate your life to become a high-performance person, we have the online accountability course and personal mentoring program that will make your dream a reality. Join us, and we'll take your life to the next level, together. Our next accelerator course is starting soon.
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Jordan B. Peterson, the Canadian clinical psychologist, cultural critic, and professor of psychology at the University of Toronto. Your book, 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos, provides practical principles on how to live a meaningful life, from setting your house in order before criticizing others to comparing yourself to who you were yesterday, not someone else today. The New York Times recently called you the most influential public intellectual in the Western world right now. And last night at the O2 Arena in London, I watched you draw a crowd of 7,000 people to your live speaking event with Sam Harris and Douglas Murray. It felt like a watershed moment. Jordan, welcome to London Real.
Thank you very much.
What was going on last night? 7,000 people, no Justin Bieber, 3 people on stage having a 2-hour discussion. Just the fact that that happened.
Yeah.
What do you make of that?
Well, I've thought about that a lot. And I think that it's the consequence, mostly the consequence of a technological revolution. The media forms that we had been, as a society, had been utilizing up till 5 years ago were very limited in their bandwidth, whether that was print journalism or TV or radio. Limited in that because the production cost was so high and the distribution cost was so high that every second counted. And so there wasn't room for long form. This wasn't only true of journalism and public affairs and that sort of thing. It was also true of drama, like on television. And 90 minutes was a long time, right? And I think everybody came to assume that the media forms actually reflected our capacity for attention and depth, and they didn't. They narrowed it. So look at what happened when Netflix popped up and HBO. No bandwidth restriction, right, in terms of time or distribution. Well, it turned out that people would be perfectly happy with 40 hours of drama. And continuous, people will even binge on that, right, with multiple plot lines. There was a huge demand for that. So you had very high quality series like The Sopranos or Breaking Bad emerge that were very complex to the level of literature, I would say. So it turns out people were smarter than we thought. They had longer attention spans. And now the new media forms, YouTube, podcasts, have revealed that there's a tremendous hunger for long-form dialogue. Your program does the same thing. These live events are an extension of that. No one knew that that market existed. Well, apparently it exists. People are in for 2.5 hours of relatively deep as we could make it anyways, philosophical inquiry. Who knew? Well, so there's the content. So obviously Sam and I have focused on issues that there's a market for from an issues perspective. But then there's also the other issue, which is that people come to these live events to see the process of inquiry unfold. And so there's the results of the process, which is whatever content we manage to generate, whatever conclusions, but there's something very engaging about being involved in an engaging conversation. And so we're providing that, apparently. And that's also great because it turns out that people want that and need it and can participate in it and can benefit from it. And so great. Hopefully it means the political dialogue could be elevated, the philosophical dialogue could be elevated. And then, well, I see it partly as driven by content, but also an emergent consequence of this technological revolution in information provision, which is a big deal, right? On-demand video of indefinite length with almost no production cost. Then also people can chop that up. They can comment on it themselves. They can listen to it with podcasts. They can do that while they're walking around. It's a big deal. These are big changes. And so we're seeing that reflected.
You said before it's not obvious that everyone can read,
Yep.
or everyone who wants to engage in long-form reading.
Yep.
And yet this is accessible, and it's a huge
Yeah,
moment.
well, there's a couple of possibilities. One is maybe more people can listen than can read, because reading is somewhat of a barrier. And it also, reading is something you have to learn how to make part of your life. You know, and avid readers do that, but not everyone does that, for all sorts of reasons, cultural and otherwise. And so not only reading is like that, but buying books is also like that. Now, but listening, man, everybody can listen. And so, and especially with podcasts, you can listen while you're doing other things. So that gives podcasts, audio, an advantage over books and over video, because of course you have to more or less sit there to watch a video. And you definitely have to sit there and do nothing else to read a book. So the audio allows people to listen, and they can speed it up now. So that's also non-trivial. And they can do it while they're doing other things. So that means all of a sudden people have an extra hour a day that they never had before, and they can use that to educate themselves with absolutely no cost, right? No personal cost, no financial cost to speak of, no additional demand on their time. So like you figure, let's say it's an hour a day for the typical person. Well, you only have 6 to 7 hours a day that you can make productive use of, because you're eating and cleaning and doing all the things you have to do to stay alive, and sleeping for 8 hours. It eats up most of the day. Now, all of a sudden, 10% of your life has been freed up so that you can investigate more complex issues if you have a mind to. Turns out that people do have a mind to. So, great. It's really something.
Yeah, we're becoming more educated then as a whole society.
It looks like it.
Yeah.
It looks like these new technology, and it's kind of what you'd hope for from a new and revolutionary technology. You'd expect that it would provide new information to larger numbers of people, and that's exactly what seems to be happening. And I think these events, so Sam and I had 4 conversations, 2 with Douglas Murray, and the first 2 had 3,000 people, the third one 8,500, and the fourth one in London last night had about 7,000. And so obviously there's a huge market for who knew, for untrammeled philosophical discourse.
How do you find debating religion with Sam on stage, you know, as he kind of takes the atheist viewpoint, and I guess you take kind of an opposing side?
Yeah.
You know, he's less emotional. Some people have said he's the critic and you're the creator. Mm-hmm. And it was very interesting watching you two last night. How has that played out over 4 different occurrences with him on stage? What have you learned? Has anything become more obvious to you or less obvious?
Well, I think I understand his ideas more and more deeply, and I've been studying them a lot since we've started this whole process, because we did 2 podcasts together last year, I think, or maybe the year before, a while ago. And so I've really familiarized myself with his work, not least because Sam is an effective and articulate spokesperson for the rationalist atheist position, which is a very widely held. It might even be, in some sense, among intellectuals, the normative position. And so the fact that he can articulate it so well, I see its lack, I see what it lacks as revelation of its fundamental insufficiency. You know, it's not a motivating ethos, atheism. And you might say, well, that doesn't matter because it's still true. It's like, well, yeah, fair enough in some sense, but it is crucial because people do need to be motivated. And so that gap, and Harris himself has said, well, atheism is fundamentally a doctrine of negation. All it states is there is no God. It's like, okay, fine, well, what do we do from there? Well, then the story gets less compelling. And so I can see it as something that's, well, it's got a destructive element, which of course is something that Nietzsche pointed out when he discussed the death of God. He said, we'll never find enough water, essentially, to wash away the blood. Right? So you lose something like that, you lose the motivating ethos of your community. And you might say, well, that's okay because we've replaced it with objective truth. And look, fair enough, man. Objective truth is what's provided us with this incredible technological power, and you have to be a fool not to see that as an advantage. But it's in an insufficient account in my estimation, and of course that's what all the discussions are about. I think we're going to release all the discussions as videos and also as audio, and I think there's clear development of both of our arguments across the course of the events, and very little repetition in the content. Some, because of course it's the same people, but I do think people will be able to track the development of thought across all the conversations. So I found it very worthwhile. Definitely made me sharper, and also made me more cognizant of Sam's arguments and why they're so attractive to people.
Yeah.
So,
but ultimately he's denying something exists, and you're trying to say, okay, this thing needs to exist to move us forward and to give us an emotional base.
Well, and that there's more to it than meets the eye.
Yeah.
And there is much more to it than meets the eye. I mean, one of my experiences has been, the more that I've delved into some of these fundamental stories, the more bottomless they become. The Cain and Abel story is particularly like that. It's 10 lines long. You could spend 10 years thinking about that story. It's so deep. It's almost impossible for me to imagine how a story that profound could be reduced to something that finite. It's mind-boggling. And of course, the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden is the same. It's like there's a reason we can't forget that story. Now, who knows what there's many reasons. Who knows what those reasons are?
Is it in our DNA somewhere?
Well, look, at minimum, you could make a biological claim, something like, and it's kind of the same claim that Richard Dawkins makes with regards to memes. See, I've always thought with Dawkins that if Dawkins thought a little harder, he would have turned into Carl Jung, because there's very little difference between the idea of a meme and an archetype. An archetype is, Jung's archetype is what you would consider a meme if you thought about what a meme was for 20 years. Right, so Dawkins came up with this interesting idea, the meme. It's like, yeah, but that's an idea that needs to be fleshed out a lot, because then you might think, well, there's a hierarchy of memes. There's some that are memorable for a while, and then you forget them, and then there's some that are way more memorable, and then right at the top there are memes that you will never forget. Then the question is, why would you never forget them? There's a reason for that, and the answer is something like, well, they're structured so that they're, well, this is a truism in some sense, they're structured to such that they're maximally memorable. But then that begs the question, why are they maximally memorable? Why is it that your memory is structured to not forget exactly that? And that's where you get tangled into the evolutionary arguments, like, well, your memory evolved. It's actually a tool. The reason you have memory isn't to remember the past. The reason you have memory is to not do the same stupid things again in the future. That's fundamentally the reason. And so you remember some things and you don't remember other things. And your memory has a shape, and these stories fit into that shape. And so at minimum, the stories have evolved to adapt to your memory. Now, I would say since your memory has evolved to adapt to the world, that implies that the stories have evolved to adapt to the world. And I think that's a perfectly credible biological case. One of the things I did manage to do, because Sam often is considered the scientist between him and I, he's the scientist in the discussion, and that's actually a misapprehension in some sense, because I've just never got around to the science in our discussions for all sorts of different reasons. But I'm very familiar with the relevant neuroscience literature that underpins what we know about human cognitive processing, the neuroscience of emotion, motivation, and cognition, and published quite widely in that field. So I managed to make at least the outlines of my biological case for the existence of such things as archetypes and profound narratives. And I think it's the best reflection of the current science, as well as working on the metaphorical level of analysis. But people will be able to judge that for themselves once we release the videos, and that should be something in August, sometime in August, once they're produced properly and the sound is edited and all of that.
And these archetypes help us survive at the end of the day.
Well, that's the argument, is that,
right.
well, great stories are patterns of adaptive behavior. They're representations of patterns of adaptive behavior. And they work at multiple levels of, that's called, I don't know how to pronounce it. I've only read it, polysemy, Polysemy. The fact that a great story is true at multiple levels of analysis simultaneously. And you see this even in popular culture. Like if you watch a show like The Simpsons, an animated show, kids can watch it, but there's content for adults. You can interpret it at different levels of analysis. And truly great stories can be interpreted at multiple levels of analysis simultaneously. That's actually what gives them depth. So when you say a story is deep, it's, well, here's a meaning. Oh, look, here's another. Oh, look, here's another one. And then the meanings often exist in parallel with one another. And great stories, and the really archetypal stories are like that. The story of Moses, for example, that's an archetypal story. The idea that people escape from tyranny, go through a crisis, spend time wandering in the desert, are moving towards a better place. It's like that's the story of life, and it's encapsulated in that story. I'm going to do a bunch of lectures on the Exodus stories sometime in the next year. So I already went through Genesis, which seemed to be was certainly very useful for me, and lots of people seem to like it.
You started talking about your father last night and said you really hadn't talked about that before, and I think it kind of got lost, but talking about how sons kind of emulate and maybe meme their fathers, and how this over time has kind of become maybe a representation of a godlike figure. But you
sure.
kind of got cut off there, and I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about that.
Well, one of the things I tend to do is to look at symbolic representations through the lens of evolutionary biology, rather than assuming that these representations are mere superstitions or play no functions. Like we have the idea that there's a deity that's father-like. So it's a disembodied spirit in some sense, that's eternal, that has paternal characteristics. It's like, okay, well, strip it of its metaphysics, only I'm not saying that fundamentally you have to strip it of its metaphysics. I'm not making that claim. I'm saying if you strip it of its metaphysics and just look at it as a biological phenomena, it's like, well, what might the idea that there's an eternal paternal spirit, what might that be a reflection of? Well, it's like, well, there's you imitating your father, but your father imitated his father, and his father imitated his father. And so in some sense, what your father actually imitated was the pattern of fathers across time. And you could think of the transcendent father as the pattern of fathers across time. And it's the right way to think about it. And it's even developmentally and neurobiologically correct, because when a child imitates his father in pretend play, you think, well, when you're pretending, we're pretending to be your father when you're playing house, for example. You're imitating your father. It's like, no. If I'm imitating you, I do this, right? So I'm mimicking what you're doing with my body. But when I'm pretending to be my father, I'm doing something way more sophisticated than that. I'm observing my father across multiple situations. And then I'm abstracting out the commonalities in behavior and attitude across those situations that make him father. And then I incorporate that and dramatize it in my pretend play. It's unbelievably sophisticated. And so it's what the child is doing in pretend play is coming to embody the disembodied spirit of the father. So that's the disembodied spirit. But that disembodied spirit is a reflection insofar as the child is making contact with the father and not just the idiosyncratic personality of his particular father. He's abstracting out the generality across all those situations. And that generality is in turn a reflection of the imitation of the father going all the way back in time. And so you think, well, that is a disembodied spirit. It's a disembodied spirit that's incarnated in the collective of fathers across time. And what is that? Well, it's a judge, that's for sure. It's a judge. Even when you interact with the hierarchy of men who are currently alive, Something can be abstracted out of that that's like the patriarchal spirit. And if you don't think that's judging you, you are not thinking. It's absolutely judging you. That's what rank orders you in a hierarchy. It's even what the feminists accuse our culture of being, that disembodied, judgmental, patriarchal spirit. There's something to that. Of course, they think of it only as a tyrant, which is a big mistake. And so...
You're saying there's function to that, and
Oh,
that's
God.
a natural selection. Of
Well,
course.
there's function in it insofar as society itself is functional. I mean, the feminist critics, the radical leftist feminist critics, to be more precise, and not all of them are even feminist, make the argument that there's nothing in our hierarchies except tyranny and exclusion. It's like, well, that's completely preposterous. They say that while sitting in comfortable armchairs with the electricity on and the water running and no riots in the street and well fed and well clothed and protected from their enemies. I mean, it's so preposterous. I can't even believe we've even come to this point.
That's because of hierarchies that they're not looking at.
Of course.
Right.
And of course the hierarchies tend towards corruption and blindness, obviously. And when they become corrupt, then they're more likely to be dominated by people who use power as their fundamental mode of being. But that doesn't mean the bloody hierarchy is nothing but a corrupt tyranny of power to begin with. I mean, that's the definition of the ultimate authoritarian state. And if you think Western society is the ultimate authoritarian state, then your level of naivety is something on the order of miraculous. So
How come we need Jordan Peterson to defend this hierarchy and even to point it out? How come there was kind of a vacuum of this before? And now I'm waiting in line last night to go in there, and men are talking about how these observations changed their lives, and they're turning them into, different types of human beings. Why? Where was this before? And why were you the one to step up and say, hey, wait a second, look at this. What you're saying is wrong. We need to, to take a look at this hierarchy and see its purpose.
Well, I think that Nietzsche claimed that Christianity died at the hands of its own insistence on truth. So imagine that we produced a religious structure across time that elevated truth to the highest level. So then truth became everything. Well, and our capacity for truth expanded, and we discovered objective truth, and we discovered scientific truth.
And technology.
Then we noticed
technology.
Then we noticed that all of these stories upon which our faith in truth were based weren't objectively true, or not in any simple sense. And we started to take the stories apart. Well, where do you stop? You take the stories apart, you take the stories apart, you take the stories apart until you're left with no superordinate value structure. Well, and then when do you stop with the criticism? Well, we haven't stopped with the criticism. The West has embarked on a radical self-critique. And my sense is, it's gone too far. It's like we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Well, what's the baby? The baby is not a skeleton. That's the thing about the West, is that we have enough food for everyone. We've produced cultures, we've produced structures, hierarchies, that certainly have a oppressive element, because hierarchies do. But every human society is a hierarchy. And most hierarchies produce nothing but misery. Our hierarchies produce a certain amount of misery and a bunch of wealth. It's like, that's something, unless you're a fan of starvation and misery. And so my sense is, let's temper the criticism with a little bit of open-eyed gratitude. I mean, Jesus, things are pretty good, even though things are still terrible. They're way better than they were. And not only that, and this is one of the things that's so amazing and remarkable and that we really haven't woken up to, not only are they way better than they were, they're getting better around the world for everyone at a rate that's nothing short of miraculous. It's absolutely beyond belief. So the life expectancy in Africa, no, that's not right. The child mortality rate in Africa is now what the child mortality rate was in Europe in 1950. I was like, that should be a headline on every newspaper. It's absolutely miraculous. And it looks like, given the UN definition of absolute poverty, that there won't be anyone in the world who's absolutely poor by 2030. We've halved the number of people in the world who are in absolute poverty between the year 2000 and the year 2012. 3 years faster than the most optimistic UN projection suggested that we should have it. Cut it in half. So
you want to tell these social justice warriors and feminists to say, hey, let's give credit for what this hierarchy is doing and not just rip it down.
Well,
for no apparent
exactly.
reason.
It's like, well, let's be sensible about this. Okay, so let's talk about hierarchies, which I do in the first chapter. First of all, I say, look, let's start with the notion that hierarchy is not the secondary consequence of the West or the patriarchy or capitalism. That's wrong. Okay, how do we know it's wrong? Well, animals organize themselves into hierarchies. So it's obviously not a mere consequence of human construction, much less human construction of Western society over the last 500 years. It's in animals. Well, how long has it been around? Well, how about 350 million years? How's that for not a consequence of capitalism? Yeah, that's pretty damn solid. And so that's why I talk about the relationship between crustacean hierarchies and the simple crustacean nervous system and our nervous system, which share a number of quite remarkable similarities. And the point isn't that we should behave like lobsters, of all the idiotic criticisms. It's that there's a neurobiological continuity that demonstrates that hierarchies are so ancient that our brains have adapted to them as if they are permanent elements of reality. And that's part of the archetype of the father, actually, is the permanent reality of the hierarchy. So the question is, well, why are there hierarchies? And the answer is, well, there's an answer for animals and there's an answer for humans. It's you have to organize a hierarchy when you're pursuing scarce resources, because otherwise it's just a war. That's the alternative. There's either a hierarchy of access, which is why chickens have a pecking order. The top chickens eat first. Doesn't mean the bottom chickens don't eat, although it does mean that if there's not enough food. And all the chickens accept the pecking order because otherwise they have to fight. You say, well, that's pretty rough on the bottom chickens. And yeah, but not as rough as being pecked to death. Like, it's rough, but it's not as rough as constant battle. So a hierarchy in some no small part is the alternative to Hobbes, to the Hobbesian state of everyone against everyone else. And so that's one reason for hierarchy. Another reason is, well, if you're going to pursue, let's assume that you have to pursue something useful to stay alive. And I don't think anybody's going to disagree about that, because you just sit around, you're going to die. So you have to go out there and do things. Well, where? Well, in the social environment. Oh yes, with other people. So you have to cooperate and compete with other people to do something useful. Well, then you're going to make a hierarchy around that goal. And in that hierarchy, two things are going to happen. A small number of people are going to be the best at doing that. So that's an iron law. That's why there's
Which is hard for people to accept sometimes.
Not everyone is a basketball star. Not everyone is a soccer star. Not everyone is a great musician. Not everyone is an artist. There's lots of hierarchies, but in each hierarchy, it's a small number of people at the top who do most of the productive work.
Everyone can't win first.
And certainly not in every game. Right? Maybe if we had enough games, there's a game for everyone where they could be first, and a pluralistic society does in fact manage that quite well. But then the other thing that happens is not only does a small minority of people do most of the productive work in the hierarchy, but most of the gains of the hierarchy go to a small percentage of the people. You see that with wealth distribution. Okay, and that's a problem. The problem is dispossession. Here's the creative hierarchy. Most people aren't contributing. Okay, what the hell are they going to do? That's a big problem. Here's the wealth hierarchy. Most people aren't wealthy. So what are the people at the bottom going to do? The left has a role in serving as a voice for those who are dispossessed by the hierarchy. But the left goes too far when it says, well, then let's get rid of the hierarchy. It's like, no, because the hierarchy is the tool that enables people to do productive labor in a social environment. So that's too much. You've gone too far. You need to be grateful for the hierarchy at the same time that you're wary of its proclivity for tyranny.
And that's what you do. You tell people when they've gone too far.
Well, that's what I'm trying to do,
right.
Is to say, trying to delimit. Well, we've kind of figured out when the right-wingers go too far. You know, right-wing identity politics devolves into claims of ethnic and racial superiority and moral justification on the grounds of those, for actions based on those categories. Right. When do the left-wingers go too far? Oh, we don't know. Well, first of all, we certainly know that they can go too far. If you don't understand that the left has gone too far, then you're woefully ignorant or you're willfully blind. Those are the two categories.
Example that was C16, which when we first started hearing about you 2 years ago, was restricted to transgender pronouns.
Yeah, well, it was for me.
Was
because,
for you.
Yeah, because my sense was, well, what's this law about? Well, it's about transgender rights. It's like, well, that's one of the things it's about. But it's also about the government's decision that they can use, that there's a certain morality of compassion, hypothetical compassion, can be used to compel the contents of voluntary speech. It's like, sorry, no, I'm not going there. You guys jumped out of your box. You're in a domain you shouldn't be playing with. I don't give a damn if you're justifying it with your false compassion, because what I saw it as was an extension of this leftist hierarchical critique rather than anything that had to do with true compassion. And so I might have been wrong about that, but I was correct in a couple of assumptions. One is that had never been attempted before in the history of British common law, of English common law. It was also made illegal by the Supreme Court in 1942 in the United States. And there was no precedent for that sort of thing in Canadian law. So the idea that that was an extension of governmental power beyond what had been attempted previously in Canadian society and in English common law history was definitely true. And
it's the free speech thing that really bothered you, when people try to regulate the free speech. That was a big alarm bell.
It wasn't even that they were trying to regulate it. We have some regulation of free speech already, right? Libel laws, for example, defamation, and so forth, and those are justifiable. Free speech doesn't mean you can lie about someone in a harmful way, for example. And maybe you could even make a case that hate speech laws are justifiable, even though I don't think they're justifiable, because it raises the specter of who defines hate, and that's actually a fatal flaw. But it's a whole different thing to say, well, here's some things you can't say, than to say, here's some things you have to say. It's like, no, sorry, what do you mean by have to? Exactly. It's like, and my sense in that situation was, I'm not doing that. So you are not compelling what I'm going to say. You've gone too far. And I think of that, I think that I have a responsibility to the content of my speech that, as far as I'm concerned, is sacred. It's like no politics in the realm of compelled speech, period. There's no way you're going there, especially not if you're motivated by your goddamn ideology. So that was a line as far as I was concerned.
You could have been fired. You almost were.
Well, the university was in an awkward position, because there was already provincial legislation that compelled such speech. And so now it was moving to the federal level. I made the case in the videos that I might have been breaking the law by making the videos criticizing the legislation, because as far as I could tell when I read the surrounding policies, that was one implication. And so then my critics came out of the woodwork and said, oh, Peterson is exaggerating the danger of this law, which is of course possible. But then the university lawyers viewed what I was doing, and they looked at the policies and they thought, no, what he's doing might be illegal and we could be held responsible for it, because that was part of the legislation, that your employer is as liable for what you say as if you said it, even if you didn't know that your employee said it, and even if the results of what they said weren't intended by the employee. That's the law. Absolutely appalling law, but that's the law. So obviously the university lawyers read the law and they thought, oh, we can't let him do this, because if it's illegal, then we're also breaking the law. So they sent me 2 letters saying, you have to stop. So then I read those letters online because they were very badly crafted. Now I told the university when they gave me the letters, I told my chairman, I said, I read the letter, I said, this isn't accurate. You should, if you're going to go after me, you should take this letter back and rewrite it properly. So I gave them due warning. She said, no, the letter stands. Like, fine. So then I read it online with all of its inaccuracies and internal contradictions. So, and then, then I negotiated with the dean. The dean was a fine guy, and there weren't malevolent people behind this at the level of the senior administration, although there was plenty of that at the level of the activist types, which are, the universities are full of. Then they agreed that we could have a debate about the issue. And that turned into a discussion rather than a debate, but that, whatever, that was the step in the right direction. And then they left me alone. And then I know, from what I've heard, this is all scuttlebutt from behind the scenes, that what the consequence of that was that the University of Toronto has actually quite intensely reaffirmed its commitment to free speech rather than equity and so forth. So they've, in the aftermath of all that, they tilted in the right direction. That's what I've been made aware of. So they didn't do too bad. I understand why the scandal erupted, because they were put in a rough place. Now, I don't feel that sorry for the university, because the university has also generated the sort of people who made those damn laws, so they're hoist by their own petard, so to speak, and that's increasingly happening, because when you make bad rules, then the people who make the rules get tangled up in them too.
And this is that leftist agenda that's promoted at universities that's kind of ripping down these hierarchies that, without actually giving them proper thought process.
Yeah, with no respect, no respect, no gratitude. No understanding, no respect, no gratitude.
How did you get from there to where you are now? I mean, the last 2 years has kind of been a whirlwind. This book, I think, is the best-selling book in the whole world in the last 6 months.
Yeah.
How did this all happen?
Well, that's a good question. You know, one answer is, well, it takes 10 years to become an overnight success. You know, I mean, it's sort of like this, but it's sort of like this. You know, like I wrote a book before this. It's a difficult book, but it had its domain of impact.
Maps of Meaning.
Yeah, I mean, I taught from that book for 30 years, so I have lots of students distributed out there. It's, you know, how many, 300 a year for 25 years, so it's 7,500 people, 7,500 to 10,000 people. So that's not no people. There was a television series made about Maps of Meaning in Canada, and so that would have been another 100,000 people, something like that. I was a commentator on a television program, a very good news program on public television again, and accrued a certain viewership because of that. I did a number of lectures for a show called Big Ideas, and there were several 100,000 people, I would say, in total, perhaps more, that were exposed to those, and those turned out to be quite popular. Even though there were 200 such lectures, they were always in the top 10. And so there was this, and then when I made these videos, I'd also put pretty much all of my courses for the last 3 or 4 years, plus a course I taught back in 1993, online on YouTube.
Yeah, early adopter of YouTube.
Yeah.
So all of your IP was out there, all your thoughts were out there publicly.
That's right.
Very few people did that.
That's right. And by April of 2016, which was 6 months before the political stuff broke, I'd already had 1 million views. And 1 million is, well, if you sell 1 million books, that's an overwhelming bestseller. So what's 1 million views on YouTube worth? Who knows? But the answer isn't nothing. So there was all, and then when people came after me, when I took my let's say political stance, which is really a philosophical, I really think it's a theological stance, not even a philosophical stance, because what I saw in that legislation was a sin against logos, like it was a crime against free speech. So there was legally inappropriate, it was philosophically inappropriate, but it was inappropriate all the way down. Do not constrain people's conscience. It's expressed in their voluntary dialogue. You're messing around with their soul. It's like you don't get to do that. And so, well, so when this scandal erupted around that, you know, and I was pilloried by some journalists and vilified by many students and faculty members who wrote petitions trying to get me fired and all of that, I had 300 hours of YouTube content. And so people could go, well, who is this man who's probably crazy, because like any Canadian that criticizes the Canadian legislative system is probably unhinged because it's a pretty good country. It's not the sort of thing we're accustomed to in Canada, worrying about our legislation. So if you stand up and say there's something crazy going on here, the crazy thing that's going on is probably you. But
you're not the typical Canadian.
Yeah, well, perhaps not. But I had all those YouTube videos online, so people could go and see what kind of reprehensible creature I was. And it turned out that, you know, I'd made everything I said to students fundamentally in my whole teaching career completely accessible publicly. And there were no smoking pistols. So that put people in a kind of a conundrum. It's like, well, he isn't obviously a radical of any sort. Well, I am in some sense, but not in any conventional sense. Right. Unconventional radical, I suppose.
And then on top of all this, you kept doubling down and going and putting yourself out there, putting your ideas out there, developing everything further, writing books. So, you know, you kind of put the pedal to the metal. When
well, the book was well underway when all of this happened, you know, because I'd been writing 12 Rules for about the last 4 years, something like that. But yeah, you know, things, well, what the first event that was really part of the snowball, there's this old saying, you know, from those who have nothing, everything will be taken. It's Matthew principle. To those who have everything, more will be given. At some point, you hit this positive feedback cycle where one thing reinforces another thing. And the first of those The first manifestation of that was probably the views on YouTube, the million views, or maybe it was 1.5 million by the time I made those other videos. It's like, that's a lot, 1 million. It's 1 in every 7,000 people. It's a lot, it's a big number. So that was already there. But then there was a demonstration, first of all, a demonstration against me at the university, and then a pro-free speech demonstration that I was invited to speak at. So I went and spoke at it, and the activists really disrupted it. They swiped the microphone and blasted white noise, and most of them were just, you know, kids, young adults protesting. But there were some nasty people there, and I could see who they were, and they were out for serious trouble. Most of them were men, and they were there in the hope that mayhem would emerge. And so I could see, and one of them was the guy who was blasting the white noise and so forth. And that was all filmed, not by me, but by people who were there, and a lot of it by the activists themselves. And then afterwards, I came down after the demonstration was over to talk to the cops to make sure that nothing too stupid had happened. And I was accosted on the way back into the building by a group of activists, and they filmed the whole interaction. And the reason they filmed it was to discredit me, and so then they put the film up, and that went viral. But it didn't discredit me, it discredited the people who made the video.
This happens a lot with your media appearances.
Yeah, it does.
Including one on Channel 4 in London.
Yes, it's happened a lot.
What does that say when they record something and don't realize it's discrediting them?
Well, that's another example of the utility of free speech. It's like, here's what happened, everybody had their say, everybody got to listen, what's the verdict? Well, hopefully, the hope is that the collective opinion is sovereign.